Hello, Night Seekers, and welcome to Lacuna Noir. This is where forgotten stories and gentle voices meet, carrying you softly into peaceful sleep, wrapped in mystery. Before tonight's stories begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Drop a comment below and let me know. And a little note before we begin. You may notice a few brief ads in the first 10 minutes, but after that, the rest of the video is completely ad-free. Just you, the silence, and the stories. So settle in, get comfortable, and let the night carry you. If you're drawn to these quiet, shadowed nights, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a story when darkness calls. There is a case from the American Southwest that still disturbs people years later, not only because of what happened, but because of how calculated and organized it was. It took place in the Arizona desert, in a remote area where homes were spaced far apart and neighbors were not always within easy reach. The isolation of the landscape played a major role in how long the crimes continued. In wide, open desert, surrounded by quiet roads and empty land, it can be easy for terrible things to stay hidden. The man at the center of this case became known as the Toy Box Torturer, a nickname that came from the room he built specifically for abuse. His real name was David Parker Ray. He lived in a trailer home in a rural part of New Mexico near the Arizona border, though many people simply associate the case with the desert region itself. What made his crimes especially disturbing was not only the violence, but the level of planning behind it. Ray constructed a homemade dungeon inside a trailer on his property. This was not a random or temporary setup. It was a carefully designed space. He installed restraints, chains, and various devices intended to control and overpower victims. He soundproofed parts of the trailer to reduce the chance of screams being heard. The room was arranged in a way that suggested long-term preparation. It was not something built in a moment of rage. It was built with intent. He targeted women. Many of them were vulnerable in some way. Some were lured under false pretenses. Others were kidnapped. Ray would drug his victims to make them disoriented and easier to control. Once they were restrained inside the trailer, he would assault them repeatedly over a period of time. The details of what happened inside that room are difficult to read and even harder to understand. He recorded audio messages that described what he planned to do to them. Those recordings later became part of the investigation and showed how deliberate and cold his actions were. One of the strangest parts of the case is that he did not always kill his victims. In many instances, he would eventually release them. Investigators believe he tried to confuse and manipulate them psychologically. He drugged them heavily, and there are strong suspicions that he attempted to make them doubt their own memories. Some women woke up in unfamiliar places with gaps in their memory, unsure of what had happened to them. In certain cases, victims later questioned whether the experience had been real because of how disoriented they felt. For years, he managed to avoid being caught. Some victims were too frightened or too unsure to report what happened. Others may not have remembered enough details to connect him directly to the crimes. The desert setting made it easier for him to operate without attention. It was a place where someone could drive for miles without seeing another car. He was not acting alone. At times, his girlfriend and possibly other associates were involved. That detail makes the case even more troubling. It was not just one person acting in secret. There were others who knew or participated. Everything began to fall apart because one victim managed to escape. In 1999, Ray had abducted a woman and held her captive inside his trailer. She was restrained with chains and a collar. At one point, Ray left the property, leaving his girlfriend in charge of watching the victim. That decision turned out to be the mistake that ended his freedom. The woman somehow managed to free herself enough to run. She fled from the trailer while still partially restrained, with a chain trailing behind her. Imagine the fear and desperation required to make that run through the desert, not knowing if someone would hear you or believe you. She made it to a nearby house and alerted a neighbor. That moment changed everything. Police were called immediately. Officers responded and began searching the area. Meanwhile, Ray and his girlfriend were driving around, reportedly searching for the woman in hopes of finding her before she reached help. Instead, they were intercepted by law enforcement. When authorities investigated the property, they discovered the trailer and the dungeon inside. The evidence found there shocked even experienced investigators. The room contained restraints, devices, detailed notes, and recordings. The audio tapes he had made describing his plans for victims were particularly disturbing. They showed that this was not impulsive behavior. It was a system he had developed and refined over time. Once he was arrested, more victims came forward. Some had pieces of memory that now made sense. Others were connected through physical evidence. There were suspicions that the number of victims was higher than officially confirmed, because many were released and heavily drugged. It was difficult to determine the full scope of his crimes. The case quickly gained national attention in the United States and was reported internationally in places like the United Kingdom and Canada. People were stunned by how organized the setup was. The idea that someone could build a torture chamber in a residential area and operate for years without being stopped was deeply unsettling. Ray was charged with multiple counts of kidnapping and sexual assault. The legal process revealed more about his methods. Prosecutors presented evidence of long-term planning, recordings, and the physical setup of the trailer. Survivors testified about their experiences. Listening to those testimonies was painful for many people in the courtroom. One of the most haunting aspects of the story is the psychological manipulation involved. Ray did not rely only on physical restraint. He attempted to break victims mentally. He used drugs to blur their perception of time and memory. He tried to convince them that no one would believe them if they reported him. That kind of control can leave long-lasting emotional damage. In 2001, he died of a heart attack while in custody, before he could serve a full prison sentence. His death meant that some questions would never be fully answered. There were ongoing investigations into possible connections with missing persons cases. To this day, some people believe that the true number of victims may never be known. The case remains one of the most disturbing examples of calculated abuse in modern American criminal history. It raises difficult questions about how predators can operate in isolated communities. It also shows how important it is for victims to be believed when they come forward, even if their stories seem confusing or fragmented at first. For many people, the image that stays with them is the moment of escape. A woman running through the desert with a chain still attached, desperate for help. That moment of courage ended years of hidden abuse. Without it, the crimes might have continued much longer. The story also highlights how easily isolation can be exploited. Rural areas often provide peace and privacy, but they can also create conditions where crimes go unnoticed. Neighbors may not hear what happens behind closed doors. Long distances between homes mean fewer witnesses. It is a reminder that danger does not always exist in crowded cities. Sometimes it hides in quiet places. Another difficult truth in this case is that manipulation can silence victims. When someone is drugged, restrained, and psychologically pressured, their memory and confidence can be deeply shaken. It becomes harder to speak up. Ray appeared to understand that. He relied on confusion and fear as tools. Over time, documentaries and books have covered the case. Each retelling brings renewed attention to the victims rather than focusing only on the man responsible. That shift in perspective is important. The real story is not about the twisted construction of a dungeon. It is about the women who survived and the strength it took for them to speak out. Communities across North America reacted strongly when the case became public. Parents worried about their daughters. Women shared their own stories of close calls or suspicious encounters. Law enforcement agencies reviewed procedures related to missing persons and assault investigations. While no system is perfect, high-profile cases often push agencies to improve awareness and communication. There is something especially unsettling about crimes that are methodical. Sudden acts of violence can be shocking, but planned cruelty feels different. It suggests patience, rehearsal, and repetition. That is what made this case stand out. It was not chaos. It was structured. Even years later, people who learn about it often say the same thing. It is hard to believe something like that could happen for so long without being exposed. But history shows that predators often rely on silence and disbelief. The more unbelievable the story, the less likely some people are to question it. In the end, the case is remembered not just for its horror, but for the survivor who refused to stay silent. Her decision to run, even while restrained, saved future victims. It stopped a cycle that had lasted years. That act of bravery deserves to be remembered as much as the crimes themselves. The desert still stretches wide and quiet in that part of the country. From the outside, nothing about it suggests what once happened there. But the story remains, passed along in news archives and documentaries, serving as a warning about manipulation, isolation, and the importance of speaking up. It is one of those cases that feels almost unreal because of how extreme it was. Yet it was real. Real victims, real trauma, real consequences. And while the man responsible is no longer alive, the lessons from the case continue to matter. In the mid-2000s, two boys who lived in the same neighborhood spent a lot of their time playing online games. One of the games they both enjoyed was Tibia, a popular multiplayer fantasy game where players build characters, collect items, and trade virtual currency. Like many teenagers and kids at the time, they would spend hours online exploring digital worlds, fighting monsters, and earning in-game coins. To them, those coins felt valuable. Even though they were not real money, they represented time, effort, and status inside the game. One of the boys was Daniel Petrie, who was around 17 years old. The other was Gabriel Cohn, who was just 12. They were not just online friends, they were neighbors. Their houses were next to each other, which meant they saw each other regularly outside of the game as well. What started as a shared hobby slowly became something much darker because of a dispute over virtual currency. At some point, Daniel gave Gabriel around 20,000 Tibia coins. Inside the game, that was a significant amount. It could take a long time to earn that many coins, depending on how someone played. Daniel expected that Gabriel would return them. Whether it was meant as a loan or part of a deal, Daniel believed the coins should come back to him. But Gabriel did not return them. Instead, he blocked Daniel online. For a teenager already struggling with emotional issues and poor impulse control, this small digital conflict began to feel like a personal betrayal. It is important to understand that for some young people, especially those deeply invested in online gaming, virtual disputes can feel extremely real. They can create anger, jealousy, and humiliation. In this case, Daniel did not see the situation as a minor disagreement between kids. He felt disrespected. He felt ignored. And instead of stepping back or talking it through, he allowed his anger to grow. Because they lived next door to each other, the situation moved quickly from the online world into real life. Daniel walked over to Gabriel's house. He knocked on the door and told him that he wanted to apologize. That must have sounded harmless. Gabriel was younger. He likely believed that whatever argument had happened in the game was about to be settled. There was no reason for him to expect what would happen next. Gabriel let Daniel inside. At that moment, no parents were home. The house was quiet. As soon as Daniel entered, he closed the door and locked it. What followed was a brutal and horrifying attack. Daniel began beating Gabriel severely. He overpowered him physically. Gabriel was only 12 years old. The age difference, along with the physical difference between them, made it impossible for Gabriel to defend himself properly. Daniel assaulted him violently and strangled him using a video game console cord. During the attack, Gabriel was conscious for much of it. He screamed in pain and fear. The violence did not stop quickly. It continued for a long time. At some point, Gabriel lost consciousness. Daniel believed he had killed him. Instead of calling for help or realizing the seriousness of what he had done, Daniel tried to hide the body. He attempted to place Gabriel inside a crawl space in the house, but the space was too small. That was when the crime became even more disturbing. Daniel went into the kitchen and took a knife and a hacksaw. He began cutting off Gabriel's arms and legs in order to make the body fit into the space. During this process, Gabriel regained consciousness. Imagine the horror of waking up in that situation. He began screaming again in agony. Daniel continued. The brutality of that moment is difficult to fully describe. It shows a level of cruelty that is hard to comprehend, especially considering the ages involved. Daniel was not a grown adult. He was still a teenager. Gabriel was just a child. Even after all of that, Daniel was not satisfied. In anger and panic, he stabbed Gabriel multiple times. Eventually, he left the scene. By that point, Gabriel had died from the injuries. Not long after, Gabriel's brother returned home. What he found was something no family member should ever have to see. He discovered the mutilated body of his younger brother. The shock and grief must have been overwhelming. He fell to his knees and screamed for help. In a single afternoon, a normal family home became the site of a nightmare that would forever change everyone involved. The case shocked the community. It also shocked people around the world when details became public. Many struggled to understand how a dispute over an online video game could lead to such extreme violence. But the truth is that the game itself was not the real cause. The coins were not the true reason. They were only the trigger. The deeper issues likely involved Daniel's mental state, emotional instability, and an ability to handle conflict in a healthy way. Reports later indicated that he had psychological problems. That does not excuse what happened, but it helps explain that this was not simply about virtual currency. It was about anger that was not controlled, about resentment that was allowed to grow, and about a teenager who made a catastrophic decision instead of seeking help. For many parents in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and other countries, this case became a warning sign about online gaming and unsupervised internet activity. But the lesson is more complex than simply blaming video games. Millions of young people play games every day without harming anyone. The real issue lies in emotional health, supervision, communication, and recognizing warning signs before something terrible happens. Gabriel was 12 years old. He was a child who likely did not fully understand the intensity of Daniel's anger. A disagreement inside a game probably seemed small to him. He could not have imagined that it would turn into something deadly. His life was taken in a way that was not only violent, but deeply cruel. Daniel was later arrested and faced legal consequences. Because he was under 18 at the time of the crime, the case involved complicated legal discussions about juvenile sentencing. The court system had to decide how to handle someone who committed an adult-level crime while still technically a minor. It raised questions about responsibility, mental illness, and rehabilitation. The story continues to disturb people years later because of the contrast between the cause and the outcome. A conflict over virtual coins led to one of the most horrific crimes involving teenagers in recent memory. It forces people to confront uncomfortable questions about youth violence, mental health, and how quickly anger can spiral out of control. There is also something especially tragic about the setting. These were neighbors. They likely saw each other often. They may have shared conversations, laughter, and ordinary childhood moments. The same house that once felt safe became the place where a young boy lost his life. For families who hear this story, the emotional impact is heavy. It reminds parents to stay involved in their children's lives, both online and offline. It highlights the importance of teaching conflict resolution and emotional regulation, and it shows how small disputes can sometimes reveal much deeper problems underneath. This was not just a crime story. It was a loss. Gabriel's family lost a son and a brother. A community lost a child. And a teenager threw away his own future in a moment of uncontrolled rage. When people summarize the case, they often say it was about a video game. But that summary misses the real tragedy. The tragedy was about a young boy who should have been safe in his own home. It was about violence that went far beyond what anyone could imagine. And it was about the devastating consequences of anger left unchecked. Stories like this are difficult to read and even harder to understand, but they serve as reminders of how important it is to pay attention to warning signs, to take emotional struggles seriously, and to never dismiss intense anger as just a phase. Behind every headline is a real child, a real family, and a real loss. Gabriel was only 12 years old. That fact alone makes the story impossible to forget. There was once a former world boxing champion from my hometown. When people talked about him, they didn't just mention titles or fights or belts. They talked about fear. He had been famous, yes, but not in a clean or inspiring way. His reputation was built as much on violence outside the ring as it was on what he did inside it. To some, he was a legend. To others, he was a warning. He grew up in the same streets as everyone else. People who had known him as a kid said he had always been tough, always quick to fight, always determined to prove something. Boxing gave him a way out, at least for a while. It gave him structure, training, discipline, and eventually fame. He climbed the ranks, fought hard, and became a world champion. For a town that didn't have many success stories, that meant something. But success didn't erase who he was. As the years passed, stories about him shifted. The talk wasn't just about titles anymore. It was about gangs, intimidation, and control. He became known as a leader of a local criminal network. People said he had influence over entire neighborhoods. They whispered about violence that never made it to court. Allegations of murder, allegations of rape, stories of people who crossed him and paid the price. No one reported him. That's the part that sticks with me. The fear was so deep that even when people claimed to know terrible things, they kept quiet. Nobody dared go to the police. Nobody wanted to be the one who spoke up. In small communities, power can become personal. If someone has a reputation for brutality and the resources to back it up, silence becomes survival. He moved through town like someone untouchable. Even when he wasn't actively competing anymore, he trained. He stayed in shape. He still carried himself like a fighter. There was an aura around him, part celebrity, part threat. Some people admired him, some avoided him. Most did both at the same time. Then one night, everything changed. He had finished training and was leaving alone. It was late. The streets were quieter. That was when it happened. More than 20 young people ambushed him. They were members of a rival gang. Whether this was revenge, strategy, or long-planned retaliation, no one knows the full truth. But it was coordinated. They attacked him with overwhelming force. Baseball bats, axes, machetes. They didn't come to scare him. They came to end him. He had built a life around violence. And in the end, violence surrounded him. Even someone as strong and trained as he was couldn't fight off that many attackers armed with weapons. He was beaten to death. The brutality didn't stop there. After he died, his body was dismembered. Parts of him were placed in the trunk of his own car. The act was not just about killing him. It was about sending a message, about humiliation, about dominance. In gang culture, symbolism matters, and this was a display meant to echo. One of the leaders involved in the attack was his illegitimate son. He was 15. That detail alone feels like something out of fiction, but it wasn't. A teenage boy leading or helping lead an attack on his own father. A father who had never fully claimed him, never fully integrated him into his recognized family. Blood ties meant nothing in that moment, or perhaps they meant too much. It's impossible not to think about what kind of childhood leads to that. What kind of resentment builds up in a boy who grows up knowing his father is powerful and feared, but distant or dismissive? What kind of environment shapes someone into seeing murder as a solution rather than a last resort? The story didn't end there. Years later, another of the champion's sons, this one publicly acknowledged, was shot to death at 19. It happened at point-blank range. The person who pulled the trigger was his stepbrother, the uncle of the 15-year-old who had helped kill the father. Family lines blurred into rivalries. Blood turned against blood again. To make it worse, his full-blooded brother had helped in that murder. By acting as the driver, it became a cycle, one killing feeding another, one betrayal leading to the next. The original champion's legacy was not trophies or admiration. It was a fractured family, divided by violence and revenge. When people talk about gang life, they sometimes glamorize it. They talk about loyalty, power, respect, and fear as if those are admirable qualities. They highlight wealth, influence, or status, but stories like this strip away that illusion. There is nothing glamorous about a life that ends in ambush. There is nothing powerful about being cut apart and placed in the trunk of your own car. There is nothing admirable about sons killing fathers and brothers driving getaway cars for other brothers. The violence becomes generational. Children grow up watching it, absorbing it, normalizing it. They learn that power comes from force, that respect is taken, not earned. They inherit grudges they didn't start. They inherit enemies they didn't choose. And often, they inherit early graves. I think about how different things might have been if fear hadn't silenced so many people. If allegations had been reported. If accountability had come earlier. But it's not that simple. Systems fail. Witnesses are intimidated. Communities are trapped between fear and survival. By the time violence becomes visible enough to act on, it's often already rooted deep. This former champion had talent, discipline, opportunity. He had already beaten odds by becoming a world champion. But whatever choices he made after that pulled him back into something darker. Boxing gave him a platform, but it didn't change the world he operated in, or perhaps the world he chose to stay part of. The tragedy isn't just his death, it's the ripple effect. The 15-year-old who led part of the ambush will live with that act forever, whether he admits it or not. The 19-year-old son who was shot never got the chance to become something else. The brothers who drove and pulled triggers tied their lives to that violence permanently. Entire branches of one family tree are marked by blood. People sometimes ask whether justice was served. Some of those involved were arrested. Some served time. But justice doesn't undo what happened. It doesn't resurrect the dead. It doesn't heal families. It doesn't erase the image of a once famous athlete beaten and dismembered by people who shared his blood. What this story really shows is how fragile the line is between fame and downfall, between admiration and fear, between being celebrated and being hunted. It also shows how violence, once normalized, rarely stops with one person. It spreads, it consumes, it leaves scars on communities that last far longer than headlines. When I hear people talk about the so-called glamour of gang culture, I think about this family, about a father killed in an ambush, about sons killing each other, about a name once associated with sports now linked permanently to bloodshed. There is nothing glamorous about that. It's messy, it's tragic, it's cyclical, and it destroys far more than it ever builds. That's what stays with me. Not the weapons, not the brutality, but the realization that once violence becomes the foundation of a life, it doesn't just end with one person. It moves through generations, reshaping everything in its path. And by the time people realize there's nothing glamorous about it, it's usually too late. In the 1990s, there was a young orphan girl whose name most people no longer remember, but her story has stayed with many who heard it. Before she was adopted, the adoption center made it very clear to the woman who planned to take her home that the child had serious emotional problems. They explained that she sometimes hurt other children and that she had a history of hurting herself as well. The staff described her as troubled, unstable, and difficult. Even so, the woman did not change her mind. She believed the girl deserved a chance at a real home, and she felt she could help her. The little girl had already lived through more than most children ever should. She had moved through different foster placements, never staying anywhere long enough to feel safe. She had learned not to trust easily. She reacted strongly to fear, to rejection, and to anything that reminded her of being abandoned. The adoption center focused mostly on her behavior problems, but they did not talk as much about the trauma that likely caused them. By the time she was adopted, she was already carrying deep emotional wounds. At first, things seemed hopeful. The woman who adopted her tried to create a stable routine. She set regular meal times and bedtimes. She tried to be patient, but the child struggled to adjust. She had sudden emotional outbursts. Sometimes she would lash out at other children at school. At home, she could go from quiet to angry in seconds. She did not know how to express fear or sadness in a healthy way, so it often came out as aggression or silence. The adoptive mother, feeling overwhelmed and unsure of what to do, decided to seek professional help. The therapist they found recommended a special kind of therapy that was sometimes used during that time for children with attachment and behavioral disorders. It was presented as a method that could break through emotional walls and help a child form bonds. The therapist explained that the child would be wrapped tightly in blankets and pillows while adults held her down in a controlled setting. The idea, according to the therapist, was that the physical pressure would force the child to confront her feelings and eventually lead to emotional release and attachment. The adoptive mother, desperate to help and trusting the professional, agreed. When the girl was first taken to this therapy session, she did not fully understand what was about to happen. She was already a child who feared losing control. And now she was placed in a room with adults telling her that this would help her. They laid her down and began covering her with heavy blankets and pillows. Then they pressed down on her body, holding her in place. At first she struggled, confused and scared. She asked what they were doing. She said she did not like it. The therapist insisted that this was necessary. They told her to stay still. They told her she needed to fight through her resistance. As the pressure continued, the girl began to panic. She asked if she could stop. Her voice was small and shaking. Instead of listening, the adults told her that she was being dramatic. They called her a quitter. They said she was acting like a brat. The message was clear. Her fear was not valid. The session went on much longer than she expected. She tried to twist free, but she could not move. The weight of the blankets and pillows pressed against her chest, making it hard to breathe comfortably. The feeling of being held down triggered something deep inside her, something connected to earlier experiences she may not even have had words for. Her body reacted with terror. Tears ran down her face, but the therapy continued. A couple of days later, she was brought back for another session. By this point, she likely felt dread the moment she entered the building. Even if no one asked her how she felt about returning, her body would have remembered. Once again, she was laid down and covered. Once again, adults pressed down on her while telling her that this would make her better. This time, her panic grew even stronger. She begged them to stop. She said she could not handle it. Instead of stopping, they criticized her again. They told her she was giving up too easily. They suggested that her refusal was proof of how damaged she was. In that moment, a frightened child was treated as though she were misbehaving rather than overwhelmed. As the pressure continued and her panic reached its peak, her body began to shut down in different ways. She vomited. At the same time, she lost control of her bowels. It was a clear physical sign of extreme distress. Only then did the therapist finally stop the session. The room was left in a disturbing state. The sight was heartbreaking. A small child, already carrying trauma, had been pushed beyond her limits. Instead of being comforted immediately, she may have felt shame. Children who experience loss of bodily control often feel embarrassed, but especially when adults respond with frustration instead of compassion. The image of that session stayed with those who later heard about it. It was not a scene of healing. It was a scene of a child overwhelmed and broken down. Looking back, many people now question that type of therapy. Practices that involve restraining children in this way have since been heavily criticized and, in many places, banned or tightly regulated. Research has shown that forcing physical restraint can increase trauma, especially for children who already have attachment disorders or histories of abuse. What was once described as innovative treatment is now widely recognized as potentially harmful. The little girl did not deserve that experience. She had already endured abandonment and instability. What she needed most was patience, safety, and consistent care. She needed adults who would validate her feelings rather than dismiss them. She needed therapy, grounded in empathy and evidence-based practice, not methods that relied on overpowering her physically. Her story serves as a reminder of how vulnerable children in the system can be. When professionals are trusted without question and parents are desperate for solutions, harmful practices can continue longer than they should. It also highlights how important it is to listen to children when they say they are afraid. A child asking to stop should never be ignored. No one can change what happened to her during those sessions. But telling her story helps bring attention to the mistakes of the past. It reminds people to question methods that sound extreme. It encourages caregivers to seek out treatments that respect a child's dignity and autonomy. In the end, what stays with most people is not the technical details of the therapy, but the image of a frightened young girl asking to stop and not being heard. That moment captures everything. She was not being difficult. She was not being a brat. She was a child overwhelmed by fear. Poor little girl, she truly did not deserve that at all. One evening a few years ago, I was walking with a close friend along a quiet road just outside our town. It was one of those back roads that does not get much traffic, the kind where you can hear your own footsteps and the wind moving through the trees. The road curved gently, and on one side there was a rocky cliff that rose steeply upward. At the top of that cliff was a thick stretch of forest. The trees were tall and dark, packed close together, and from where we were walking below, the forest looked almost like a solid wall of green and shadow. On the other side of the road, there was more forest, but it was flatter and spread out across open land. The whole place felt isolated, but not in a scary way at first. It just felt quiet and calm. We were talking casually, not about anything serious, just everyday stuff. I remember glancing up at the cliff because the height of it always caught my attention. The rocky face had uneven edges and loose stones, and it would have been difficult for anyone to climb down safely without slipping. As I looked toward the top, something moved near the tree line. At first, I thought it was just my eyes adjusting to the contrast between the sky and the dark woods. But then I realized I was looking at a person. There was a man stepping out from the forest at the top of the cliff. What made it strange immediately was that he was moving backward. He was facing the forest, not facing outward toward the drop. He stepped slowly, carefully, but without turning his head. It was as if his attention was locked on something inside the woods. His body was angled toward the trees while his feet carried him backward toward the edge. He looked like an old-fashioned lumberjack. That is the only way I can describe it. He was wearing what looked like a black and red plaid shirt, the kind you picture when you think of someone chopping wood in cold weather. He had on blue jeans, worn and simple. On his head was a raccoon fur hat, the type with the tail hanging down the back. It was not a modern winter hat. It looked old, like something from another time. The details were clear enough for me to recognize the style, but there was something off about him, too. He seemed slightly faded, almost transparent, as if the background could be seen faintly through him. I did not feel fear right away. I felt confusion. I remember thinking, why is he walking backward like that? Does he not realize how close he is to the edge? He kept stepping backward, still staring into the forest. There was no sign that he was aware of the drop behind him. Then he reached the very edge of the cliff. I expected him to stop, or to turn, or to react in some way. Instead, he took one more step. He fell. It happened in a second. His body tipped backward over the edge. But before he could hit the rocks below, before there was any sound of impact, he vanished. He did not tumble down the cliff. He did not land. He simply disappeared in midair. One moment he was there, falling, and the next moment there was nothing. Just empty space where he should have been. I stood there frozen, staring at the spot where he had been. My heart was beating faster, but not in a full panic. It was more like my brain was trying to process something that did not make sense. I blinked a few times, expecting him to reappear or to see some sign that I had misunderstood what happened. But there was nothing. The cliff looked completely normal again. The forest at the top was still. The rocks below were empty. I turned to my friend and told him what I had just seen. I tried to explain it calmly, because I did not want to sound ridiculous. I said I had just seen a man walk backward out of the forest and fall off the cliff. I half expected him to laugh or say I was joking. Instead, he looked at me in a way that made my stomach tighten. He said he saw something too. At first, we both hesitated. It felt strange to admit it out loud. He said he had also noticed a figure at the top of the cliff. He described a man stepping backward while facing the forest. When he said that, I felt a chill run through me. That detail was too specific. It was not just a random shape or a trick of the light. He described the exact same movement I had seen. But we were both skeptical of each other at the same time. It is easy for two people to accidentally influence each other's memories without realizing it. I started wondering if maybe I had spoken in a way that planted the image in his mind. He probably wondered the same thing about me. We did not want to jump to conclusions, so we decided to test it in a simple way. We agreed that we would describe what the man was wearing, but only partially. One of us would give a detail, and the other would add something without being prompted. That way, we could see if our descriptions matched naturally. My friend went first. He mentioned the hat. He said it looked like one of those old fur hats, like raccoon fur, with the tail hanging down. He also described the position the man was in, walking backward while facing the forest. Hearing that confirmed exactly what I had seen. Then I added what I remembered about the clothing. I told him the man was wearing a black and red plaid shirt and blue jeans. That detail had stood out to me clearly because it fit the lumberjack image so perfectly. I expected him to nod immediately. Instead, he paused. He said he was not sure about the colors. He told me that the figure he saw looked more like shades of blue, not bright red and black, more like faded blue tones. He said everything about the figure seemed slightly washed out, almost as if it did not have full color. That made me think harder about what I had seen. The plaid pattern had been clear to me, but the overall appearance had also seemed slightly transparent. Maybe the colors were not as bold as I first thought. Maybe my mind filled in part of it, because plaid is what you expect a lumberjack to wear. The more I thought about it, the more uncertain I felt about the exact shades. What I knew for sure was the movement, the hat, the backward steps, and the fall that ended in nothing. We stood there for a while after that, both staring up at the cliff. The forest looked completely ordinary. Birds were still moving in the trees. The sky was clear. There was no sound of anyone climbing or falling. No sign of disturbance. If someone had really fallen from that height, we would have heard something. We would have seen a body on the rocks below. But there was nothing. As we continued walking, the conversation shifted between trying to rationalize it and trying to avoid talking about it at all. We suggested possible explanations. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe the angle of the sun created a reflection that looked like a person. Maybe our brains misinterpreted shadows between the trees. The human mind can create patterns where none exist. That is a fact. But the part that was hardest to explain was that we both saw it. And we both saw the same unusual behavior. A man walking backward while facing the forest. That is not a common shape or movement for the brain to invent randomly. It was too specific. Later that night, when I was alone, the image came back more clearly. I pictured him stepping backward slowly, as if he was either being pulled or carefully retreating from something inside the woods. The fact that he never turned around felt important somehow. It was like he was completely focused on whatever was in front of him, even though the real danger was behind him. I also could not shake the moment he disappeared. People do not simply vanish midair. Even if it had been an illusion, my mind had completed the image of him falling. The sudden emptiness where his body should have been felt wrong in a way that is hard to describe. I know how it sounds. It sounds like something made up for attention. It sounds like one of those strange stories people post online just to scare others. But it is not. I have replayed that moment many times, and I still cannot explain it in a way that fully satisfies me. Sometimes I try to tell myself it was just a shared misperception, that two people can convince themselves of something in the moment. Memory is not perfect. It changes over time. Maybe what we saw was not what we think we saw. But other times, usually late at night, I remember how real it felt. The quiet road, the rocky cliff, the trees, the backward steps, the hat, the fall, and the empty air where he should have been. Even now, years later, there are nights when I sleep with the light on. Not because I think I will see him again. Not because I expect something to appear in my room. But because once you witness something you cannot explain, even if you try to reason it away, a small part of your mind stays unsettled. And that unsettled feeling never fully goes away. In March of 1911, New York City was a very different place from what it is today. The skyline was growing, factories were busy from morning to night, and thousands of immigrants were trying to build new lives in America. Many of them were young women who had arrived from Eastern Europe and Italy, hoping for opportunity and stability. Instead, most found themselves working long hours in crowded garment factories for very little pay. One of those factories was the Triangle Shirtwaist Company, located in the Ash Building near Washington Square in Manhattan. The building itself was 10 stories tall, which at the time made it one of the larger commercial structures in the area. The Triangle Shirtwaist Company occupied the top 3 floors, the 8th, 9th, and 10th. Inside those floors, hundreds of workers, mostly young Jewish and Italian immigrant women, spent about 9 hours a day sewing shirtwaists, which were a popular type of blouse worn by women during that period. They worked 6 days a week and earned somewhere between $7 and $12 a week. For many families, that small income was still essential for survival. The work environment was far from safe. Fabric scraps were everywhere. Large bins filled with leftover cloth were placed around the factory floors. The sewing machines were packed closely together, leaving little space to move. The doors were often locked during working hours. Some employers at the time claimed this was to prevent theft or unauthorized breaks, but it also meant that in an emergency, workers could not leave freely. Fire safety regulations were weak, and enforcement was inconsistent. Many factory owners focused more on productivity than protection. On the afternoon of March 25th, 1911, everything changed. It was a Saturday, and many workers were finishing their shifts. Around 4:40 p.m., a fire started in one of the scrap bins on the 8th floor. The exact cause was never officially confirmed, but it was likely due to a discarded cigarette or match. In a room filled with dry fabric and paper patterns, a small spark was all it took. Within minutes, flames began to spread rapidly. The first alarm sounded about 5 minutes after the fire started. But by then, the flames were already climbing up through the building. On the 10th floor, executives were able to use a telephone to warn workers and begin evacuating. Some workers on that floor managed to escape by going to the roof and then crossing to a neighboring building. But on the 9th floor, the situation was far worse. There was no audible fire alarm on the 9th floor. There was also no direct telephone line. Many of the workers there had no idea what was happening below them until smoke began pouring into their workspace. By the time they realized the danger, the stairways were already filling with thick smoke and flames. Panic spread quickly. Hundreds of young women rushed toward the exits. One of the stairway doors was locked. Workers tried desperately to open it, but it would not budge. That single detail would later become one of the most shocking facts of the tragedy. The freight elevator was used as an escape route by some, but it could only carry a small number of people at a time. The elevator operator made several trips up and down as flames grew closer, but eventually the heat and smoke made it impossible to continue. The fire escape on the outside of the building seemed like another option, but it was old and poorly constructed. Under the weight of too many people trying to flee at once, it collapsed. Workers fell from the structure to the ground below. Others were trapped at the windows with nowhere to go. When firefighters arrived, they worked as fast as they could, but their ladders were only long enough to reach the 7th floor. The fire was raging on the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors. The hoses did not reach high enough with strong pressure. From the street below, crowds gathered in horror as they watched what was unfolding, with smoke filling the rooms and flames blocking exits. Some workers faced an impossible choice: stay inside and risk burning or suffocating, or jump from the windows. Many chose to jump. Witnesses described seeing young women holding hands before leaping. Some stood on window ledges for seconds that must have felt like hours before stepping off. They fell nearly 100 feet onto the concrete pavement. The sound of bodies hitting the ground was something many bystanders said they could never forget. As many as 62 people died from jumping alone. Others were burned alive or died from smoke inhalation while trying to find a way out. The fire moved so quickly that it was over in less than half an hour. But in that short time, 145 people lost their lives. Most of them were teenage girls and young women, some as young as 14. The streets around the building became scenes of chaos and grief. Families rushed to find their daughters and sisters. Some identified loved ones by scraps of clothing or personal items because the bodies were so badly burned. Temporary morgues were set up to handle the number of victims. The entire city was shaken. What made the tragedy even more painful was that many of the deaths could have been prevented. If doors had not been locked, if fire escapes had been stronger, if alarms had been audible on every floor, more workers might have survived. The disaster exposed the dangerous conditions that many industrial workers faced at the time. The stories of those who survived are just as powerful as the statistics. Some workers escaped by climbing onto the roof and being helped by students from New York University and the building next door. Others squeezed into elevators that were descending despite flames licking the doors. A few managed to make it down smoke-filled stairways in the final moments before they became unusable. Bystanders on the street described feelings of helplessness. They watched as firefighters tried to catch jumpers with nets, but the force of the falls caused the nets to tear. People screamed. Some fainted. Others stood frozen, unable to believe what they were witnessing. In the weeks that followed, the city demanded accountability. The factory owners, Max Blank and Isaac Harris, were charged with manslaughter. However, they were later acquitted in criminal court. That verdict angered many citizens. Although civil lawsuits followed and financial settlements were made, no punishment could truly balance the loss of so many young lives. The fire became a turning point in American labor history. It sparked outrage and led to investigations into factory conditions. Labor activists and unions used the tragedy as proof that workers needed stronger protections. New laws were introduced in New York State to improve workplace safety, including requirements for unlocked exits, better fire drills, and safer building codes. The International Ladies Garment Workers Union gained support after the fire. Reformers such as Frances Perkins, who later became the first female U.S. Secretary of Labor, were deeply affected by what they saw that day. She would later say that witnessing the fire shaped her commitment to labor reform for the rest of her life. Today, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire is remembered as one of the worst industrial disasters in United States history. But it is not just a historical event. It is a reminder of the human cost behind unsafe working conditions. It represents the struggles of immigrant communities trying to survive in a new country. It shows how tragedy can lead to change, even though that change often comes too late for those who suffered. When students in American history classes learn about it, many feel the same shock that people felt in 1911. It is one thing to read numbers in a textbook. It is another to imagine young women your own age standing at a window looking down 10 stories, knowing there are no safe options left. The building still stands today, now part of New York University. A memorial plaque honors the victims. Each year on March 25th, people gather to read the names of those who died. They are remembered not just as factory workers, but as daughters, sisters, and members of families who came to America with hope. The stories of survivors and witnesses continue to be shared because they remind us why labor laws matter. They remind us why workplace safety is not just a regulation, but a responsibility. And they remind us that behind every major reform in history, there is often a tragedy that forced people to pay attention. The fire lasted less than 30 minutes, but its impact lasted generations. It changed laws, it strengthened unions, it reshaped public opinion. Most importantly, it made people see factory workers as human beings deserving of protection and dignity. 145 lives were lost that day. Many were just beginning their adult lives. Their dreams ended in smoke and flame, but their memory helped protect countless others in the years that followed. That is why, more than a century later, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire is still taught, still discussed, and still remembered. Sorry to pause for just a moment. If this is your first time here, welcome. I hope you're enjoying the calm so far. If you'd like more nights like this, true stories, gentle rain, no interruptions, please subscribe to Lacuna Noir. It really helps me keep creating these peaceful experiences for you. And tap the bell so you're here every time a new story arrives in the dark. Now, back to the story. When I first heard about what happened on that campus, it did not feel real. It felt like one of those stories people whisper about late at night, the kind that spreads through dorm rooms and classrooms until it becomes part of the school's history. But this one was real. It happened not long before I arrived, and even years later, people still talked about it in quiet voices. There was a college-age guy who had been seeing a girl who was around 15. The relationship itself raised questions, especially considering the age difference. From what people said, it had not been something public or widely known. It was more like a secret connection that only a few close friends might have known about. Then one night, something happened. No one outside of that room knows exactly what led up to it. What is known is what came after. Her body was found in one of the lakes on campus. The campus had several small lakes scattered around the grounds, mostly peaceful places where students would sit, study, or just relax between classes. They were never places associated with danger. That is what made the discovery even more disturbing. She had been wrapped in sheets. Her body was hidden, but not well enough. Eventually, someone saw something in the water that did not belong there. When authorities recovered her body, they realized the situation was far worse than anyone expected. She had been killed, and her head had been removed and found elsewhere. The brutality of it shocked everyone. This was not just an accident. It was not a simple crime of passion. It was violent and deliberate. The news spread quickly. Students gathered in common areas watching television reports, and parents called their kids in panic. Social media lit up with rumors, half-truths, and speculation. The campus that had once felt safe suddenly felt different. People began locking their doors more carefully. Late-night walks stopped. Even daytime felt uneasy. What ultimately led to the suspect being arrested was something small but crucial. The guy's roommate happened to be watching a news report about the case. The cameras showed footage of the scene, including the sheets the victim had been wrapped in. The roommate recognized them immediately. They looked like the sheets from their shared apartment. The pattern, the color, something about them stood out in a way that felt unmistakable. He went back to their place and checked. The sheets were missing from his roommate's bed. That detail made everything click into place in a horrifying way. Imagine realizing that someone you live with might be connected to something like that. The roommate did not ignore it. He contacted the police. That phone call changed the course of the investigation. When authorities questioned the college student, the pieces began to come together. Evidence tied him to the crime. He was arrested, and the story that had once been rumor became confirmed fact. For many students, it was the first time they truly understood that violence was not just something that happened somewhere else. It could happen close to home. It could involve people your own age. Even after the arrest, the campus did not return to normal quickly. There was a heaviness in the air for months. Professors acknowledged it in class. Counselors were made available. Some students transferred. Others stayed, but carried a sense of unease with them. It is hard to walk past a place where something terrible happened and not feel it in some way. That was not the only unsettling event connected to that campus. During my first year there, another tragedy happened. A freshman boy reportedly died by suicide after falling from the top floor of one of the dorm buildings. Officially, it was ruled as a suicide. That is what was announced publicly. But many students were not convinced. The details did not fully add up, at least not in the eyes of those who lived there. People talked about the way the window had been broken. Some said the glass pattern looked more like it had been shattered from the outside. Others mentioned that the angle of the fall seemed strange. There were small inconsistencies that fueled suspicion. Nothing concrete enough to challenge the official ruling, but enough to create doubt. In dorm hallways and dining halls, conversations about it were quiet but intense. Some students believed he had been pushed. They pointed to arguments he had reportedly been involved in. They questioned whether everything had been investigated thoroughly. Others said people were just looking for something dramatic to believe because it felt easier than accepting suicide as the truth. No matter what the reality was, the result was the same. A young life ended suddenly. A family lost their son, and students who were barely adults themselves were forced to think about mortality in a way they had never considered before. What made that second incident even stranger for me personally was something I still cannot explain. Around the time it happened, I was with a group of friends. We were sitting together, talking and laughing. It was a normal evening. Nothing felt heavy or unusual. Then, without any clear reason, the conversation stopped. It was not like someone received a message or heard a loud noise. There was no interruption from outside. We just all went quiet at the same time. It was almost like a shared pause. One minute we were laughing, and the next we were sitting there in silence. The silence lasted maybe a minute or two. It felt longer than that, though. No one looked at their phone. No one said anything like, "What just happened?" We just sat there. I remember feeling a sudden chill, like the air had changed. Then, just as strangely as it began, the moment passed. Someone made a small comment, and conversation resumed. Later that night, we found out about the freshman who had fallen. The timing was close enough to make the memory of that silent moment unsettling. It is easy to say it was coincidence. Maybe we all just ran out of things to say at the same time. Maybe we were subconsciously tired. But the way it happened felt synchronized, almost unnatural. When people talk about campuses, they often imagine freedom, growth, and new beginnings. And for the most part, that is true. But campuses are also small cities. Thousands of young people live, study, and interact in close quarters. With that comes the full range of human behavior, both good and bad. Looking back, those two incidents changed how I viewed the place. It was no longer just lecture halls and dorm rooms. It was a place where real tragedy had occurred. The lake was no longer just scenery. The dorm building was no longer just a structure. They became markers of stories that people did not like to revisit but could not fully forget. Even now, years later, when I think about that campus, those events come back first. The image of the lake. The idea of a roommate recognizing something as simple as a set of sheets and realizing what it meant. The broken window. The unexplained silence among friends. I do not claim to have answers for any of it. Some things were proven in court. Others remain debated in whispers. But what stays with me most is how quickly normal life can shift. One moment you are walking to class or sitting with friends, and the next you are hearing about something that changes the atmosphere entirely. It reminds me that places are not just buildings. They carry memories. They carry stories. And sometimes, even when the official explanation is given and the headlines fade, a feeling lingers that is harder to explain than the facts themselves. When I was younger, I was not exactly making the best decisions. I was a teenager, reckless in the way teenagers sometimes are, thinking more about having a good time than about consequences. My friend Brian and I used to spend a lot of our evenings at our buddy Pablo's place. Pablo lived in a two-family house in a quiet neighborhood that felt pretty ordinary during the day. At night, though, it had a different energy. We would go there to drink beers, even though we were underage, laugh too loud, and just hang out without worrying about much. Pablo's family lived upstairs, and downstairs there was another family. The people downstairs seemed normal enough. They had parties pretty often. Music would be playing, lights on late into the night, people coming and going. Sometimes we would get invited down and we would join them for a bit. We were just kids looking to feel older than we were. It felt harmless at the time. But there was one thing about that house that always felt off to me. On the front porch, almost every single day, there was an old woman sitting in a chair. She sat there no matter what the weather was like. Sunny, cloudy, warm, cool, it did not matter. She would be there. She barely moved. She would just sit and stare straight ahead, not at anything specific, just out toward the street. I have always been the type of person to greet people. Even as a kid, I would say hello to neighbors, smile, nod, whatever felt polite. So every time I walked up those stairs to Pablo's place, I would say, "Hi, how are you?" or "Good evening." She never responded. Not once. She did not nod. She did not blink. She did not shift in her chair. At first, I brushed it off. I figured she was just old and maybe hard of hearing. Maybe she was in her own world. Still, it was strange how completely unresponsive she was. The way she looked made it even more unsettling. She had long gray hair that hung loosely, and her skin looked pale and thin. There was something hollow about her expression. She kind of reminded me of the woman from The Taking of Deborah Logan. That same vacant stare. It was not that she looked aggressive or threatening. It was more that she looked completely disconnected, as if she was there physically, but not really present. Hours would go by, and she would not move. We would arrive in the afternoon sometimes, and she would already be sitting there. When we left late at night, she would still be in that same spot. It became almost normal to see her there, a weird part of the background. Then one night, everything changed. We had been drinking, probably more than we should have. It was late. The house was quieting down, and we decided it was time to head home. All three of us, me, Brian, and Pablo, walked downstairs toward the porch. The only light came from the porch bulb and the streetlights beyond. The air felt thick and still. As we stepped onto the porch, we heard something. It was not loud, just a small sound like a shift or a scrape. We paused and looked over the railing that led down the stairs, thinking maybe someone was outside or maybe an animal had moved through the yard. I swear on everything. When we turned back around, she was standing directly behind us. She had not been there a second before. I would have seen her. The chair was still there, but she was no longer sitting in it. She was just standing there, so close that I could feel how near she was. None of us had heard her stand up. None of us heard footsteps. We all froze. I remember my heart dropping into my stomach. My mouth went dry. Out of pure reflex, I tried to act normal. I forced out a shaky, "Hey, how you doing?" It sounded nothing like my usual friendly greeting. It sounded scared. For the first time ever, she responded. Her voice was low and scratchy, like it had not been used in years. She looked at us, really looked at us, and said, "Can you boys stand the sight of blood? Because tonight, I'm going to kill myself in the bathroom." Then she laughed. It was not a normal laugh. It was thin and high and wrong. It echoed in that small porch space in a way that made my skin crawl. The three of us did not say another word. We ran. We pushed past her and ran down the stairs as fast as we could. I do not even remember how we got off the porch without tripping. We just ran. I did not look back. The entire walk home, my heart would not slow down. The alcohol haze was completely gone. I felt sober and terrified. My mind kept replaying her words, the way she said it so calmly, the way she laughed afterward. It did not feel like a joke. It did not feel like a drunk rambling. It felt deliberate. When I got home, I went straight to my grandmother. She was still awake. I told her everything. I probably sounded frantic. I told her about the old woman, about what she said, about how she had been sitting there every day for as long as I could remember. I asked her to call the police. I said someone might actually hurt themselves. My grandmother listened carefully. Then she said something that made my stomach twist even more. She told me that the family who lived downstairs had been there since my mother was my age. She knew them well. She said there had never been an old woman living there, not a grandmother, not an aunt, no one elderly. I argued. I told her we saw her every day. I told her she sat on the porch constantly. I told her she had just spoken to us. My grandmother shook her head. She insisted that no elderly woman lived in that apartment. That was the moment when the fear changed from immediate panic to something deeper and colder. It was one thing to be startled by a strange neighbor. It was another thing entirely to realize that According to everyone else, that neighbor did not exist. The next day, I asked Pablo about it. He looked just as confused. He admitted he had never actually spoken to her. He just assumed she was related to the downstairs family. We tried to think back. Had we ever seen her go inside? Had we ever seen her talk to anyone else? I could not remember a single time. After that night, I did not see her again. The porch chair was still there for a while, but it was empty. No old woman, no silent staring, nothing. I asked the downstairs neighbors casually one day if they had a grandmother who visited. They looked at me like I was crazy and said no. To this day, I do not know what we experienced. Maybe there was a simple explanation. Maybe there was someone visiting temporarily, and my grandmother just did not know. Maybe the alcohol exaggerated the moment, and my memory filled in gaps. That is what I try to tell myself when I want to sleep. But I cannot explain how she stood up without making a sound. I cannot explain how she was suddenly behind us. And I definitely cannot explain why she disappeared completely after that night. Her words still echo in my head sometimes. Can you boys stand the sight of blood? The way she said it so casually, like she was commenting on the weather. Even now, years later, when I think about that porch, I do not picture Pablo's house first. I picture her, sitting in that chair, staring straight ahead, waiting. I do not know who she was. I do not know why she was there every day. And I do not know why, out of all the times I greeted her, she chose that one night to finally answer. When my father was around 22 years old, his life nearly ended before it had really begun. He was young, just starting adulthood, probably making plans and imagining what his future might look like. Then he was diagnosed with leukemia. It was not a mild case. It was severe, aggressive, and frightening in a way that most people cannot truly understand unless they have faced something similar. Back then, treatment options were not as advanced as they are today. Chemotherapy existed, but for the kind of leukemia he had, the only real chance at survival was a bone marrow transplant. And even that was not guaranteed. A transplant is not as simple as a blood transfusion. It requires a very specific match. Doctors tested donor after donor, searching for someone whose bone marrow was compatible enough to give him a real chance. They searched for months. During that time, my father had to live with the knowledge that his survival depended on someone else's biological compatibility. Imagine being 22 and knowing that your future rests on whether or not someone in the world shares enough genetic markers with you. It must have felt like waiting for a lottery result where the prize was your own life. Family members were tested first. Siblings often have the highest chance of being a match, but even then, the odds are not certain. My father's brother, my uncle, was tested. If he had not matched, the search would have continued, but the chances would have dropped significantly. There was no guarantee they would find another suitable donor in time. My uncle turned out to be a match. That one fact is the reason I am able to write this today. If he had not matched, my father might not have survived. The transplant was performed, and against the odds, it worked. The cancer was cleared. Over time, he recovered. He lived. He built a life. He reached 54 years old and beyond, something that once seemed uncertain. One of the strangest parts of the whole story is what happened to his blood type. Before the transplant, my father had blood type B. After receiving my uncle's bone marrow, his blood type changed to type O. That is something most people do not realize can happen. Bone marrow is responsible for producing blood cells. When you receive someone else's marrow, your body begins to produce blood based on their genetic material. In a very real biological way, part of my uncle lives in my father's bloodstream. That detail has always felt almost symbolic to me. My father survived because his brother literally gave him the foundation of his blood. It is not poetic language. It is biological fact. When I think about it, the whole situation feels fragile. So many things had to line up perfectly for my father to survive. The diagnosis had to be caught in time. The doctors had to recommend the transplant. My uncle had to agree to be tested. He had to match. The transplant had to succeed. My father had to recover without fatal complications. Each step was uncertain. And then there is me. I am adopted. That adds another layer to the story. My existence in my father's life was not guaranteed by biology. It was shaped by timing and survival. If my father had not survived leukemia at 22, he would not have been alive years later when I was born. He would not have been there to adopt me. So my life as I know it would not exist in the same way. Sometimes that thought hits me harder than I expect. If my uncle had not matched, if the transplant had failed, I might have grown up in foster care. I might have been moved from house to house. I might never have found a permanent family. Depending on the circumstances, I might not even have been born or carried to term. There are so many unknown possibilities. It is strange to think that my entire life rests on a medical match that happened decades before I was adopted. I often imagine my father at 22 sitting in a hospital room, probably scared but trying to be strong. He had no idea that years later he would adopt a child who would think about his survival in this way. He was just trying to live. Leukemia is not just a word. It is a disease that changes families. It forces people to confront mortality at an age when most are thinking about careers or relationships. For my grandparents, it must have been terrifying to watch their son go through that. For my uncle, the pressure of being a potential match must have felt overwhelming. And yet, he stepped forward. Bone marrow donation is not painless. It requires medical procedures and recovery. It is not a small act. My uncle made that choice, and in doing so, he saved his brother's life. Because of that, my father was able to build a future that included me. When I was younger, I did not fully grasp the weight of that story. It was just something my family mentioned occasionally. Dad had leukemia when he was young. It sounded distant, almost unreal. But as I grew older, I began to understand how close we came to a different outcome. It is easy to take existence for granted. We assume that the people in our lives will always have been there. We forget that behind every adult is a chain of fragile moments that could have gone differently. A single test result, a single donor match, a single medical decision. I sometimes think about the idea that my father's blood changed from B to O. That detail alone feels almost like a metaphor for transformation. He went through something that could have ended him, and he came out different, but alive. His body carries evidence of that battle every day. His blood type tells the story. There is something humbling about knowing that your life is connected to events you were not present for. I was not there in that hospital room. I was not there during the months of searching for a donor. I was not there when doctors said they found a match. But my life is shaped by those moments anyway. Being adopted already gives you a certain awareness of chance. You know that your family was formed by decisions, not biology alone. Add in something like a life-threatening illness that almost prevented your parent from surviving, and that awareness becomes even sharper. It does not make me feel afraid in a constant way, but it does make me feel grateful. grateful for medical science, grateful for my uncle's willingness to help, grateful that my father's body accepted the transplant, grateful that he lived long enough to see my birthday, to meet me, to choose me. Sometimes people talk about fate or destiny. I do not know if I believe in those things in a mystical sense, but I do believe in the power of small moments that ripple outward. A blood test, a compatible sibling, a successful surgery. Those moments created a future where I was not just another child in the system, but someone with a father who had already fought hard to stay alive. When I think about how close everything came to being different, it is almost overwhelming. Not in a scary way, but in a way that makes me pause. My life could have unfolded in a completely different direction. Instead, it unfolded here. My father is 54 now, healthy, alive, here. That is not something he was guaranteed at 22. And because he is here, so am I, in the way that matters most. It is strange how something that happened decades ago still echoes forward. A disease, a transplant, a change in blood type, a survival story that became the foundation for another life. Sometimes the scariest part is not what happened, but what almost did. A friend of mine once told me a story about his cousin that has stayed with me for years. It happened a long time ago, back when news about AIDS was first beginning to spread, and people were deeply afraid because so little was understood about it. There was no internet, no instant fact-checking, no quick reassurance from medical websites. Fear traveled through word of mouth and television reports, and it often felt larger than life. His cousin had gone to the Bahamas for a vacation. It was supposed to be a relaxing getaway. She had saved up, booked a small bungalow near the water, and was looking forward to a break from normal life. The trip had gone smoothly for most of the week. Sun, beaches, warm nights, simple happiness. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. On the night before she was supposed to fly back to the United States, something happened that changed everything. Her bungalow was broken into. When she returned from dinner, she found signs that someone had been inside. Drawers were open. Her suitcase had been rummaged through. Her money was gone. Her jewelry was missing. Her camera had disappeared. Even her passport had been taken. It was a nightmare scenario for a traveler. Being in another country without identification, without cash, without basic belongings. She reported it immediately, but there was little that could be done. Police came, took a statement, looked around, but there were no clear leads. The thief was gone. Eventually, after dealing with embassy paperwork and replacement documents, she managed to return home. She tried to move on from it. Losing valuables was upsetting, but at least she was physically unharmed. She told herself that it could have been worse. For a while, it seemed like an unfortunate travel story. Nothing more. About 2 months later, something arrived in the mail. It was a card, no return address that meant anything to her. Just a plain envelope. She opened it casually, expecting maybe a late travel promotion or junk mail. Instead, photographs fell out onto the floor. When she picked them up, she felt her stomach drop. The photos showed 2 different people, completely naked from the waist down. The images focused on their backsides. In each photo, her toothbrush was inserted into them. The toothbrush she had used every day during her vacation. The same one she had packed in her luggage. The same one she had brushed her teeth with morning and night. The people in the photos were smiling, posing, making a mockery of it. But their faces were not fully identifiable. It felt deliberate. Like someone wanted her to know exactly what had happened, but not who had done it. The shock was immediate. First came disbelief, then disgust, then something deeper and more terrifying. This was at the height of the early AIDS panic. At that time, many people believed the virus could be contracted in ways that we now understand are not realistic. There was widespread fear and confusion. Education was limited. Medical information was not as accessible. Her mind immediately went to the worst possible outcome. She had used that toothbrush repeatedly after the break-in. She remembered that it had tasted slightly off at times, but she had assumed it was the water or just the unfamiliar environment. Now those memories replayed in her head in a different light. The thought that someone had violated something so personal, something that went directly into her mouth, created a level of psychological distress that is hard to describe. It was not just a gross prank. It was a deep invasion. It felt targeted. It felt cruel. She went to doctors. She demanded testing. Even when initial results came back negative, fear lingered. In those days, people were told that certain illnesses might not show up immediately. The waiting period for certainty felt endless. Every minor symptom, every headache or sore throat became a source of anxiety. The emotional impact was severe. She suffered a nervous breakdown. The combination of disgust, humiliation, and fear overwhelmed her. She began therapy and stayed in counseling for years. It was not only about the health scare. It was about trust. It was about safety. It was about realizing that a stranger had been inside her private space and had chosen to do something deliberately cruel just for the sake of torment. Looking back, it is easy to say that information is more accessible today. People have heard stories about extreme or disturbing behavior. The internet has exposed society to things that would have once seemed unimaginable. But back then, most people were more sheltered from that level of intentional cruelty. It was not something that crossed your mind when you left a toothbrush in your hotel bathroom. The idea that someone would break into a room and do something like that just to send photos later felt beyond comprehension. It was not theft alone. It was psychological manipulation. Whoever did it wanted her to know. They wanted her to imagine what had happened. They wanted her to question every memory of that trip. Even today, years later, the story still makes people uneasy. The act itself is disgusting, no matter the era. Some things do not become less disturbing with time. In fact, knowing that someone had access to her space and chose to target such an intimate object makes it even worse. She eventually tested negative for any diseases. Physically, she was fine, but emotionally, it took much longer to recover. Therapy helped her process the fear and regain a sense of control. Over time, the intensity of the panic faded, but the experience changed how she traveled forever. To this day, she does not leave personal items exposed in hotel rooms. She keeps her toothbrush sealed or locked away. She is careful in ways she never imagined she would have to be. And the friend who told me this story says that whenever he travels, he does the same. He buys a disposable toothbrush and stores it in the safe when he is not using it. Some might say that is extreme, but once you hear a story like that, it sticks with you. It reminds you that you never truly know what a stranger with access to your room might do. Most people would never think to tamper with something so personal. But all it takes is one person with twisted intentions to create a lifelong fear. The scariest part is not just the act itself. It is the waiting, the uncertainty, the wondering whether something invisible had already entered her body. In a time when AIDS was seen almost as a death sentence, that fear was paralyzing. The story also highlights how vulnerable we can feel when traveling. You trust that your hotel room is secure. You assume that a locked door protects you. But sometimes that trust is misplaced. And when someone violates it, in a deeply personal way, the damage is not just financial. Years have passed since it happened, but the image of those photos falling onto the floor still haunts her. It turned what should have been a simple burglary into something far more disturbing. It turned a vacation memory into a trauma. And even though the world has changed and we are exposed to far more shocking stories now, disgusting is still disgusting. Violation is still violation. And sometimes the scariest experiences are not the ones that involve physical harm, but the ones that invade your sense of safety in a way you never saw coming. There is something especially unsettling about accidents that happen in places most of us will never see. Ships, especially large commercial vessels, are like floating cities. Passengers and visitors usually see only the clean decks, the railings, the open water. But deep below that, hidden behind steel walls and heavy doors, is the engine room. It is loud, hot, and full of machinery that never truly rests. That is where this story takes place. A crew member worked in the engine room of a ship. His job involved maintaining parts of the engine that most people would not recognize by name. They were large mechanical components, connected to the systems that powered the ship forward. Working on them required focus, technical knowledge, and a tolerance for extreme heat. The engine room is not a comfortable environment. Now, even when everything is running normally, temperatures can climb high. Noise from the machinery echoes off metal surfaces, and every surface feels industrial and unforgiving. This crew member was experienced. He had worked on those engine components many times before. It was part of his routine. On one particular day, he was down there with another crew member. They were performing maintenance, checking something inside one of those large engine compartments. Some of these sections are accessible through hatches, which open into tight spaces where repairs can be made. They are not designed for comfort. They are designed for function. At some point, the crew member climbed inside one of those compartments to work. The other crew member was nearby. What happened next is where the uncertainty begins. The second crew member left the area for some reason. Maybe he was called away. Maybe he thought the task was complete. Maybe he assumed his colleague would exit shortly after. The details were never fully clear. After he left, the hatch to that engine compartment closed. Whether it closed because of vibration, a malfunction, or someone physically shutting it is unknown. But it closed, sealing the man inside. In a space like that, once the hatch is shut, there is little room to maneuver. There may not be an internal release. These are not rooms meant to be occupied casually. They are part of a machine. At first, no one noticed anything was wrong. The engine room continued operating. The ship was docked at the time, preparing to depart. Crew members were busy with their own responsibilities. But it was only later that someone realized the engineer was missing. Search efforts began quickly. Crew members checked common areas, cabins, and workstations. They called out his name over communication systems. But time was tight. The ship was scheduled to leave the dock, and departure procedures were underway. In maritime operations, schedules are strict. Delays can cost money and disrupt entire routes. There is something deeply tragic about that detail. They were searching, but they were also under pressure. The man was somewhere on board, but the ship could not remain docked indefinitely. Eventually, the vessel left port. It was not until later, when the ship stopped again and a more thorough search was conducted, that they found him. His body was discovered inside the engine compartment. By then, it was too late. The assumption made by many was that he had been trapped and succumbed to the extreme heat inside the engine system. Engine rooms can become dangerously hot, especially when machinery is running. A sealed compartment within that environment would amplify the temperature. Without ventilation, without a way to open the hatch from the inside, survival time would be limited. Heat exhaustion can happen quickly. Heat stroke can follow. In extreme conditions, the body shuts down. The idea that he may have realized he was trapped, may have tried to push against the hatch, may have called out only to be unheard over the roar of machinery, is difficult to imagine without feeling a sense of dread. But the uncertainty lingers. Was it truly an accident? Could the hatch have closed on its own? Was it standard practice to leave someone inside without a clear signal? Was there a failure in procedure, or something more deliberate? Engine rooms are controlled environments. Hatches are not usually left unsecured without reason. Some require manual closing. Others may swing shut under vibration. Without being there, it is impossible to know whether it was a freak accident caused by mechanical forces or something more intentional. Speculation about possible foul play naturally followed. Ships are isolated once at sea. They are closed systems. If someone wanted to harm another crew member, it would not be impossible. But there was no clear evidence pointing toward murder, no obvious signs of struggle, no witness who reported seeing anything suspicious, just a closed hatch and a man who never came back out. The other crew member who had been working with him must have carried an enormous weight afterward. Leaving someone behind unintentionally, even for a few minutes, could lead to lifelong guilt. Even if it was not his fault, even if procedures were followed, the memory of walking away while someone else remained inside must be haunting. In dangerous professions, safety procedures are everything. There are usually strict rules about confined spaces. Typically, someone entering a compartment should have a spotter outside. Communication should remain open. Equipment should be powered down or secured. If any of those steps failed, it raises questions about training and oversight. When tragedies like this happen, investigations follow. Maritime authorities would have examined logs, mechanical systems, witness statements, and maintenance records. They would try to determine whether the hatch had malfunctioned or whether human error was involved. In many industrial deaths, the final conclusion is labeled as accidental. But that word can feel inadequate when someone has died alone in a metal chamber. There is something uniquely frightening about being trapped in machinery. Not in open water, not in a storm, but inside the very engine that keeps the ship alive. The irony is painful. The system he helped maintain became the place where he lost his life. It is also unsettling how quickly someone can disappear in a place like that. One moment you are a part of the crew working side by side with others. The next, you are isolated in a sealed compartment while the world above continues moving. When the body was finally found, the reality of it must have hit the crew hard. They had searched, they had called out. But the answer had been just feet away, hidden behind steel. There is a sense of helplessness in that. Whether it was a freak accident caused by a hatch swinging shut, or a failure in procedure, or something more sinister, the result is the same. A life ended in a confined space, surrounded by heat and noise, unnoticed until it was too late. Stories like this remind us how dangerous certain jobs can be. Engine rooms are not designed with comfort in mind. They are built for function and power. And when safety systems fail, even briefly, the consequences can be fatal. It is one of those cases where the mystery makes it linger. If it was clearly mechanical failure, that is tragic but understandable. If it was human error, that is devastating but explainable. If it was something darker, that possibility adds another layer of unease. In the end, what remains is the image of a man going about his normal duties, stepping inside a compartment he had entered many times before, not knowing that this time he would not step back out. And somewhere above, the ship continued preparing to leave port, unaware that one of its own was trapped below. Whether accident or something more, the story stays with you because of the isolation, because of the heat, because of the closed hatch, and because sometimes, even in a place filled with people, someone can be completely alone. When something like that happens close to home, it feels different than hearing about it on the news from far away. It stops being just another headline. It becomes personal, even if you never met the person. In my city, a 13-year-old girl was stabbed to death. Not once or twice, but more than 100 times. The number alone was shocking. It felt unreal. The person accused of doing it was my age, a teenager. I did not know her. I had never spoken to her, never passed her in the hallway, never shared a class. But that did not matter. The fact that she was my age made it impossible to distance myself from it. 13 is barely into your teenage years. You are still figuring out who you are. You are thinking about school, friends, maybe sports, maybe social media drama. You are not supposed to be part of a crime scene. When the news broke, it spread quickly through Snapchat and Instagram, screenshots of news articles, short clips from local reporters, updates from people claiming to know details. Almost immediately, petitions started circulating online. People were sharing links demanding that the boy be tried as an adult. Every time I opened my phone, there was another story, another post, another angry message. It was the first time something like that hit so close to my own age group. I had heard about murders before, of course. Everyone has. But they always felt distant. Older people, other cities, different lives. This was different. This was someone my age killing someone younger than me. That fact would not leave my head. The number of times she was stabbed kept repeating in conversations. It was not just that she died. It was how violently she died. That kind of anger, that level of force, is hard to understand coming from someone who is still technically a kid. It forced me to think about what people my age are capable of. I have never personally known anyone who has died. I have not stood at a funeral for a friend. I have not had to process that kind of loss up close. So maybe that is part of why this hit so hard. It was like a sudden realization that death is not something that only happens to adults or in faraway places. It can happen here. It can happen to someone who was probably doing normal teenage things just days before. The part that unsettled me the most was not even the legal debate about whether he should be tried as an adult. It was the realization that life can be taken away by anyone, for almost any reason. It is easy to move through your day assuming that you will make it home, that tomorrow will come. We all kind of live with that assumption. But when something like this happens, that assumption cracks. I found myself thinking about random moments, walking home from school, sitting on a bus, being out late with friends. You start to see everything differently. Not in a dramatic, constant fear kind of way, but in a quieter awareness. The idea that someone else's decision, someone else's anger, could suddenly end your life. It also made me look at people my own age differently. Teenagers joke around, fight, argue, say things they do not mean. But this was not just a fight. This was extreme violence. It forced me to ask questions that I never really thought about before. How does someone get to that point? What kind of thoughts are going through their head? Was it planned? Was it sudden? Was it something building up over time? Social media did not help. Everyone had an opinion. Some people were angry and wanted the harshest punishment possible. Others talked about mental health. Some spread rumors that were later proven false. Watching it all unfold online made everything feel louder and more chaotic. It was like the tragedy became content for people to argue over. At the same time, there was a strange sense of helplessness. I did not know her. I could not comfort her family. I could not change what happened. All I could do was watch and think and try to process it. And processing something like that as a teenager is not simple. For the first few days after hearing about it, I felt this heavy weight in my chest. Not exactly fear, not exactly sadness, but something in between. It was the loss of innocence in a way. The understanding that being young does not make you immune to harm. I also thought about how quickly someone's story can end. One day she was alive, texting friends, maybe worrying about homework. The next day she was gone, and her name was everywhere in the news. That shift from ordinary life to headline felt brutal. The petitions about trying him as an adult were another layer of complexity. On one hand, the crime was horrific. On the other hand, he was still a teenager too. It made me realize how complicated justice can be. When someone young commits something so violent, people struggle to decide how to see them. As a kid, as an adult, as both, I do not have answers for any of that. I just know that it changed something in me. It made me more aware of how fragile life is. Not in a way that makes me paranoid, but in a way that makes me think more deeply. It also made me appreciate the ordinary days more, the boring days, the days where nothing dramatic happens. Because the truth is, none of us know how long we have. That sounds dramatic, but it is also just reality. Being a teenager already comes with a lot of emotions. Add something like this, and it feels overwhelming. You are still learning how to understand the world, and suddenly the world shows you something brutal. I still think about her sometimes, even though I never met her. I think about her family. I think about the friends she probably had. I think about how her classmates must feel walking through school halls, knowing she is not there anymore. More than anything, it made me realize that violence is not just something from movies or distant cities. It can happen anywhere. It can involve people who were sitting in class just like you. And once you realize that, you cannot unsee it. It stays with you. Not as constant fear, but as awareness, a reminder that life is fragile and that the choices people make matter more than we sometimes understand. There was a case in my city that still unsettles people years later, not because it involved strangers passing through, but because it involved someone who lived quietly among everyone else. She was not someone who stood out. She had family. She had relationships. From the outside, her life looked ordinary. But behind closed doors, something unthinkable was happening over the course of nearly a decade. Over a span of 8 years, this woman became pregnant 5 separate times. That means there were 5 pregnancies, 5 births, 5 infants. The first 4 pregnancies were completely hidden from almost everyone around her. Her family did not know. Her friends did not know. People who saw her regularly had no idea she was carrying a child. How she managed to conceal it each time is something that still confuses many people. Some pregnancies are easier to hide than others depending on body type and clothing, but hiding one pregnancy is difficult enough. Hiding 4 in a row takes planning, and constant deception. The fifth pregnancy was slightly different. The father of the baby and a few family members began to suspect something. They noticed changes in her body. They questioned her. She admitted she was pregnant, but later claimed she had suffered a miscarriage. She explained it away in a way that satisfied those around her, at least on the surface. No one pushed further. No one demanded proof. Life continued. What no one knew at the time was that she was giving birth at home, alone, inside her own bathroom. Instead of going to a hospital, instead of seeking medical help, she delivered each baby by herself. After the births, she did not take the infants to a doctor. She did not tell anyone they had arrived. The details that later came out in court documents were chilling in their simplicity. The babies were born alive. That fact was determined through forensic examination later. When investigators examined the teeth of the infants, they found evidence showing that some of them had lived between 1 and 4 days. That detail is hard to process. It means they were not stillborn. They breathed. Their hearts beat. They existed in the world, even if only briefly. There was no evidence of brutal physical violence in the traditional sense. It appeared she did not use weapons or obvious force. Instead, the assumption was that she either failed to provide basic care or intentionally deprived them of what they needed to survive. A newborn cannot live without feeding, warmth, and attention. Simply withholding those things is enough to cause death. Whether she actively harmed them or allowed them to die through neglect, the result was the same. After each birth, she placed the infants in plastic bags. She hid them in containers she had around her home. She did not report anything. She did not tell anyone. She continued living her life as if nothing had happened. And then, months or years later, she would become pregnant again and repeat the process. The case might have remained hidden even longer if not for a simple complaint. Someone in the apartment building where she lived reported a foul smell coming from the basement. At first, it may have seemed like something minor, maybe a plumbing issue, maybe garbage left too long. But when police came to investigate, they made a discovery that shocked everyone involved. In the basement, they found badly decomposed bodies of 5 infants. The condition of the remains was so advanced that determining exact causes of death became difficult. Time and decomposition had erased many of the clear signs investigators rely on. Still, the evidence was enough to connect the deaths to her. Court documents later described how she had given birth in the bathroom and hidden the babies in the plastic bags and containers. What makes the story even more disturbing is that she moved residences 3 times during those 8 years, and each time she took the remains with her. Instead of leaving them behind or disposing of them in some other way, she transported them from one home to another. In earlier years, she had stored some of the bodies in a freezer. After her most recent move, she placed them in the basement. That detail changes how the case feels. It was not just a single moment of panic or fear. It was a pattern. It was repeated behavior. It was a decision made 5 separate times. And after each decision, she chose to keep the evidence close to her. Family members later described her as a pathological liar. According to those who knew her well, she had a long history of bending the truth, fabricating stories, and manipulating situations to avoid responsibility. That reputation made it difficult to fully trust anything she said once the case went to trial. Some wondered whether she had convinced herself of her own lies over time. During the legal process, mental health evaluations were conducted. In cases like this, the court must determine whether the person understood what they were doing and whether they were capable of distinguishing right from wrong. In her case, it was determined that she was mentally sane. She was not found legally insane. She was considered aware of her actions and their consequences. That conclusion had major implications for sentencing. Ultimately, she received a 13-year prison sentence because it was her first conviction and under local laws regarding early release for good behavior. It was likely she would serve roughly half that time if she followed prison rules. For many people in the community, that sentence felt too light considering there were 5 separate deaths. Others pointed out that the legal system must operate within guidelines and definitions that do not always align with public emotion. Still, it was hard for residents to wrap their heads around the fact that someone responsible for 5 infant deaths might spend only a handful of years behind bars. The emotional impact on the community was deep. This was not a stranger passing through. This was someone who had lived among them for years. Neighbors who once exchanged casual greetings with her suddenly replayed every memory, wondering if there had been signs they missed. Friends questioned conversations about supposed miscarriages. Family members looked back at moments that now felt suspicious. The idea that 5 infants lived briefly, only to be hidden away and forgotten, is something that continues to haunt people. It forces uncomfortable questions about secrecy, denial, and how someone can compartmentalize such acts and continue with everyday life. It also raises difficult discussions about mental health and pregnancy. There are documented cases of pregnancy denial where a woman genuinely does not accept or recognize that she is pregnant. There are also cases of postpartum mental illness. But in this situation, the court determined she understood what was happening. She concealed the pregnancies deliberately. She hid the births. She moved the remains. Those actions suggested awareness rather than confusion. For many in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and elsewhere, cases like this stand out because they challenge assumptions about motherhood. Society often views mothers as protectors. When a mother becomes the source of harm, it creates a kind of psychological shock. It does not fit the narrative people expect. Years later, the building where it happened still carries the weight of the story. People who lived there at the time remember the day police cars arrived. They remember the smell complaint that turned into something far darker. Even after renovations and new tenants, the memory lingers. The fact that she carried those remains with her during 3 separate moves suggests something complicated and disturbing about her mindset. It was not just about hiding a crime. It was about maintaining control over the secret. Every time she packed up her belongings, she chose to include those containers. It is easy to focus only on the horror of the discovery. But what stays with many people is the long stretch of years before it came to light. 8 years, 5 pregnancies, 5 births, and no one fully knew. And it is a reminder of how much can happen behind closed doors without public awareness. In the end, the court delivered its sentence. She went to prison. The legal chapter of the story moved forward. But for those who learned about it, the emotional questions remain. How does someone live with such a secret? How does someone repeat the same act 5 times? And how do communities make sense of something so far outside normal understanding? The case is not just about crime. It is about concealment, denial, and the fragile line between private life and hidden tragedy. It is a story that continues to disturb because it unfolded slowly, quietly, and in plain sight without anyone realizing what was truly happening. Look, if you're still watching, you already know what this channel is. No jump scares, no fake drama, just real stories about real people who survive things most of us can't even imagine. And that's scarier than any movie could ever be. If you want more of this raw, unfiltered truth, told the way it deserves to be told, subscribe to Lacuna Noir. We're not here to waste your time. We're here to tell the stories that actually matter. Thanks for listening. Now go get some sleep, if you can.